What do you do? What do you do in the bath?
The Council of Economic Advisers is a body that provides economic briefings and information to the office of the President, and has done since Truman's day. It's currently headed by one of the least terrible people in the Trump administration, Kevin Hassett, but it's put out a bizarre report entitled The Opportunity Cost of Socialism. I'll put it down the bottom, but while this has been provided to Trump, it's extremely doubtful that he will read it because it runs into tens of pages. So I'm just going to look at the summary, and you can look at the rest for yourself. But it is bizarre. It does look as though it has been written to play into Trump's probable existing prejudices and lack of knowledge and so on. But to anyone with any real knowledge of economics or history or political theory or political science, it's just weird. So let's jump into it, at least the summary.
Today, the Council of Economic Advisers, CEA, released a report outlining the opportunity costs of socialism on the macroeconomy, including standards of living and the impact on the federal budget. Below is the executive summary. Read the full report here.
Economics is basically voodoo, so you can't really trust anything any economist says about anything. Economics is only really predictable in the short term or in very broad sweeps in the long term. It's a lot like weather. There's a lot of semi-random forces all interacting with each other, and it can consistently surprise you, and it's so chaotic that it defies our ability to predict. Even so, it can be useful to understand some of the terms that they use, and already we're into bizarro land because the idea of opportunity cost is something from microeconomic theory, not macroeconomic theory. The idea of opportunity cost is that when you have two mutually exclusive options, the opportunity cost is what's the cost of the road not taken? What are you missing out on by choosing one particular way of doing things? And when it comes to socialism, this is usually something of a false dichotomy, because you're not necessarily choosing between one thing and another. You're selecting the best way to do things, but you can leave other options open for other people should they so wish. Take healthcare, for example. The UK has socialised healthcare. It also has private healthcare. So you have the best of both worlds, if you want. For everybody, there's nationalised healthcare, socialised healthcare, and for those who can afford it and who want to spend out, they can top up with privatised healthcare if they so wish. And actually, it's a win-win, because the existence of the nationalised healthcare increases the available resources and brings down the cost of the private top-up. So often, but not always, this is a false dichotomy, and we haven't even got into the meat of even the summary of the report yet.
Coincident with the 200th anniversary of Karl Marx's birth, socialism is making a comeback in American political discourse. Detailed policy proposals from self-declared socialists are gaining support in Congress and among much of the electorate.
For all that there are genuine communists, you idiot, on the fringes of the left, I think in America what we've seen is a slow waking up, a realization, the slaying of the ghost of McCarthyism, that socialism and Marxism, that socialism and communism, that socialism and totalitarianism are very different things. In times that are tough for regular folk, it's populism, either on the left or right, that gains ground. America is innately rather conservative and rather hostile to left-wing ideas, or at least traditionally has been, and perhaps we're seeing a shift to a more harmonious political understanding with the rest of the world. And things like this report feel like something of a rearguard action, unnecessarily demonizing the economies and politics of a lot of nations which are actually America's allies around the world. So while there are lunatic fringes on the left lying in this way, conflating socialism with Marxism, all of these kind of things, this demonization, this harking back to McCarthyism very much feels like this kind of rearguard action of trying to smear. Now, I would advise people on the right, if they would listen to me, not to do this, to tackle what socialism actually is, what your political opponents are actually talking about. Consider how useless it has become for people on the left to call you Nazis and fascists and so on. Nobody believes it, even when it's true or close to true, because it has been wildly overused and applied in situations where it doesn't count. Similarly, throwing the spectre of communism at anyone who is remotely even centrist, let alone left-wing, it's not going to stick. It doesn't have any mileage, and it's going to be self-defeating in exactly the same way that calling you all Nazis and racists and misogynists and bigots and all the rest has ceased to have political currency. So I would advise you, if you would listen, not to do this. When you gang up on Nancy Pelosi and call her a communist, you just look laughably misinformed.
It is unclear, of course, exactly what a typical voter has in mind when he or she thinks of socialism, but economists generally agree about how to define socialism, and they have devoted enormous time and resources to studying its costs and benefits. With an eye on this broad body of literature, this report discusses socialism's historic visions and intents, its economic features, its impact on economic performance, and its relationship with recent policy proposals in the United States.
I don't think it's that unclear at all. I think people in the rest of the world understand what they mean when they say socialism, and I think increasingly that Americans understand too. I think the American socialist platform is basically what Kyle Kalinske of Secular Talk, what the Justice Democrats are talking about. Things like Medicare for all and investment in education and so on. Social investment, economic investment in the lower rungs of society to help bring everybody up. That seems to be, to me, what Bernie Sanders and the other, what passes for the American left are talking about, which are, at best, from a European point of view, very, very centre-left and not really that radical at all, and yet in the American context seem out there for some reason.
We find that historical proponents of socialist policies and those in the contemporary United States share some of their visions and intents. They both characterize the distribution of income in market economies as the unjust result of exploitation, which should be rectified by extensive state control. The proposed solutions include single-payer systems, high tax rates, from each according to his ability, and public policies that hand out much of the nation's goods and services free of charge, to each according to his needs. Where they differ is that contemporary democratic socialists denounce state brutality and would allow individuals to privately own the means of production in many industries.
I think there we can already see the confusion that's occurring between Marxism and communism and socialism. There was a split, if you like, in left-wing thought. Marxists viewed what they were doing as scientific socialism, and they redefined socialism to mean something different to what it actually means. For them, it was the control of the means of production. It was a step on the path to full communism, where everything would come under state control in the name of the people. Socialism also exists as its own ideology, where socialism doesn't mean that, and that's from the original thread of socialism, which, ironically, the Marxists, the communists, dismissed as being utopian, and yet that form of socialism is the form that we see to some extent in every first world country, including the United States, though in a much reduced, starved and emaciated form. But I think we can see that the paradigm that these people are coming from to try and understand this rise in democratic socialism is one where they confuse it for Marxism, and you kind of get that sense of lack of understanding when they talk about private ownership of the means of production. Socialism, as its own ideology, as its own separate thing, doesn't involve seizing the means of production at all. There's no contradiction between capitalism, but in a regulated market, and socialism of this kind. So they don't understand what they're critiquing, and that's why so much of this falls flat. Or they do understand what they're critiquing, and they're dishonestly either playing into Trump's prejudices, because by all accounts he doesn't like being contradicted, or they're trying to present him a view that is radically different in order to help demonize this movement in the eyes of the president and through him to his base and so on. Who knows? I'm inclined to believe it's down to malice, which if you think about it is a bit more flattering than saying it's incompetence.
In assessing the effects of socialist policies, it is important to recognise that they provide little material incentive for production and innovation, and by distributing goods and services for free, prevent prices from revealing economically important information about costs and consumer needs and wants. To this end, as the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, 1976, once argued, socialist governments always run out of other people's money, and thus the way to prosperity is for the state to give the people more choice to spend their own money in their own way.
Bear in mind that Thatcher, the memory of Thatcher, is hated in the United Kingdom. She did away with so many things. She didn't believe in society. She gave us a housing crisis that we're still feeling the effects from. She's not a good person to go to if you want to be popular, or even if you want to talk about effective economic or other social policies. She made a handful of people extremely rich, and she helped foster the same kind of a self-made bootstrap delusion that unfortunately so many Americans suffer from. So she's not really a good thing to go to. There are probably still queues to dance and piss on her grave now that formed when she died. You know, if you joined the queue then, you're probably only just about now getting to the front. That's how much she was hated. But so other people's money isn't true. You're all members of the same state, so it's our money, and we're all clubbing together for things. So you could look at it, if you want to use the analogy of a house share, yeah? You all live in the same place, you all share certain things, like you all use the same kitchen, you probably all use the same lounge and the same TV and so on. And there's things you can afford by clubbing together that makes it cheaper and easier for everybody to get the kind of things that they want. Like, maybe if you club together, you could afford a kick-ass home cinema system, or an enormous plasma TV, or there's so many different things. Plus, you know, spreading the cost makes it easier for everyone to manage, you know, all the bills and everything. So that's a way to kind of think about it. All analogies break down under close examination, but there is an economic benefit to spreading the cost between lots of people. You've got economy of scale, bargaining power, the weight on each individual person is lessened, and so forth. And it's not other people's money, it's our money together, which we are spending in a more cost-effective and beneficial way to everyone. And it often works out cheaper and better that way, quite frankly. So, it's not really free isn't much of an argument. The point is it's free at the point of use, and is often cheaper and more effective that way. The other thing you have to consider is that often choice is an illusion. You know, choice is genuine when you're in, I don't know, the cereal aisle of the supermarket or whatever, and you're trying to decide whether you want the sugar-frosted milk or the choco balls or whatever it might be. You know, that's a kind of meaningful choice. But when you get sick, you don't really have any choice. You've got the doctors in the hospital and so on that are local. When it comes to mass transit, you don't really have a choice. You know, the train stops where it stops, and the train company that has the franchise for that line has the franchise for that line. you don't have any meaningful option of choice there. So it doesn't restrict choice. Privatization in those instances just gives people a monopoly. So there's no reason why in a more socialist system, such as much of the world has, you can't have choice where it's meaningful, and you can't have economy where it's meaningful. Socialism doesn't propose everything be controlled by the state. It does propose that it be overseen, kept fair, that too much power isn't allowed to be invested in one place, but it's not as hostile to markets or to capitalism or to choice as is being presented here.
Whether socialism delivers on its appealing promises is an empirical question. We began our investigation by looking closely at the most highly socialist cases, which are typically agricultural economies, such as Maoist China, Cuba, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Their non-democratic governments seized control of farming, promising to make food more abundant. The result was substantially less food production and tens of millions of deaths by starvation. Even if highly socialist policies are peacefully implemented under the auspices of democracy, the fundamental incentive distortions and information problems created by large state organizations and the centralized control of resources are also present in industrialized nations, as is currently the case in Venezuela. Lessons from poorly performing agricultural economies under socialist regimes carry over to government takeovers of other modern industries. They produce less rather than more.
You say you're going to talk about socialism, and then you talk about failed Marxism, failed attempts to get to communism. When left-wing people say real communism has never been tried, they're kind of right in that none of these Marxist revolutions, none of these Marxist states have ever gotten to the point of communism. They all get stalled in Marxist socialism, which is the control of the means of production by the state and so on. And little wonder, I think this is a fatal flaw in Marxist thought. But socialism is not Marxism, even though Marxism uses the term to mean something different. And so looking at Venezuela, looking at Cuba, looking at the USSR, looking at China, none of these are examples of socialism. The places where you want to be looking are Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, places like this. These are modern socialist states, the inheritors of the utopian socialism, as the Marxists dismissed it from before, and they are all very successful. There have been enormous innovations and so on in these countries. They do very well, punch above their weight. This used to be true of the UK, less so as time goes on, as our economy has become more Americanized, really. And now with us disentangling from Europe, science is one of the big things that stands to lose. Why is that such a loss? Well, because the EU and a lot of EU nations invest a lot of public money in innovation, in science, in projects that private companies simply cannot afford to do by themselves, or that they're not interested in doing because they don't see the economic benefit, though frequently there is an unforeseen economic benefit to doing these things. Venezuela arguably was a Marxist socialist country and was doing pretty well, all things considered, but under Maduro it's not. It's yet another totalitarian dictatorship. It's a complicated situation. I don't have time here. This is already going to be a long video to go into the problems with that. Mao, similarly, there's a split from Maoism and Marxism. Cuba, another totalitarian dictatorship. This is a problem with totalitarianism and anti-intellectualism in the USSR under Stalin, with the nonsense of Lysenkoism and so on. This has nothing to do with socialism. You're looking in exactly the wrong place. Socialism works fine.
These countries are examples of a more general pattern of socialism's negative output effects. Such outcomes have also been observed in cross-country studies of the effect of greater economic freedom, quantified as an index of taxation and public spending, the extent of state-owned enterprises, economic regulation and other factors, on real gross domestic product, GDP. This literature finds a strong association between greater economic freedom and better economic performance. It suggests that replacing US policies with highly socialist policies, such as Venezuela's, would reduce real GDP by at least 40% in the long run, or about $24,000 per year for the average person.
When it comes to economic freedom, the US is not that high on the scale when you come to look at it. It's 10th in the 2018 rankings, behind some socialist nations such as Denmark, arguably Canada, Switzerland. Yeah, there's other nations that are considered ahead of the US when it comes to economic freedom, but economic freedom measurements are a bit contentious. Perhaps a better indicator is social mobility. And social mobility, that is economic class mobility, is much higher in more socialist nations than it is in nations more like the US or the US itself. Why is this? Well, the socialist investment in education, in tackling poverty, in handling things like healthcare so that people don't get bankrupted and so on, by the costs associated with healthcare, that gives people greater economic freedom, greater chances to fulfill their potential, to rise to the level of their skill, to do well in society. America sells itself often on this idea that anyone can succeed, and yeah, this is true in just about any nation. You know, you can get incredibly lucky, born to the right parents, born into a wealthy enough family that you can exploit the education system or get handed a particular position or something. But it's more common and more likely in nations that tackle poverty, that tackle housing, that tackle healthcare, that invest time and money and effort in education so that each and every child can flower to the fullness of their potential economically and socially. And the US doesn't do that because it takes an extremely individualist and self-reliant view, which is good to an extent, but it actually wastes a lot of potential.
Although they are sometimes cited as more relevant socialist success stories, the experiences of the Nordic countries also support the conclusion that socialism reduces living standards. In many respects, the Nordic countries' policies now differ significantly from what economists have in mind when they think of socialism. For instance, they do not provide healthcare for free. Nordic healthcare financing includes substantial cost sharing. Marginal labour income tax rates in the Nordic countries today are only somewhat higher than in the United States, and Nordic taxation overall is surprisingly less progressive than US taxes. The Nordic countries also tax capital income less and regulate product markets less than the United States does. However, the Nordic countries do regulate and tax labour markets somewhat more. Thus, American families earning the average wage would be taxed $2,000 to $5,000 more per year net of transfers if the United States had current Nordic policies. Living standards in the Nordic countries are at least 15% lower than in the United States.
Well, that's just laughably wrong on many different levels. When you look into quality of life indices and human development indices, America doesn't even make the top 10. Let me see here. This was a study from this summer, and the top 10 countries for quality of life were New Zealand, Iceland, both pretty socialist, United Kingdom, still fairly socialist, just clinging on, Netherlands, pretty socialist, Norway, pretty socialist, Sweden, pretty socialist, Switzerland, pretty socialist, Australia, quite socialist, Denmark, pretty socialist, Canada, also pretty socialist, and number one was Finland, pretty damn socialist. Now, if the quality of life was so much better in the United States than the Nordic countries, then the US should have been at number one. It wasn't, and every nation ahead of it was pretty goddamn socialist. So that's just not accurate for starters. I don't know where they're getting these ideas from, so I can't counter it more specifically than that. While you would pay more tax in the Nordic countries, in any more socialist country, you have to consider what you're getting for that money. I mean, what are you paying currently for private healthcare, for example? Or what are you losing out on in salary for your company to provide you with private healthcare? These socialized healthcare systems provide better care, better outcomes, better quality of life, better longevity, all of these things much more cheaply than the US offers. The US is something like 37th in the world rankings of health systems, and every single one of the countries ahead of the US has some form of socialized medicine, and it's cheaper and more effective. So if you're fiscally conservative, this is something that you should be for. I mean, I'm going to healthcare constantly because it's probably the best example. Others are a little more, there's arguments one way or the other, but when it comes to healthcare, absolutely. So while you'd be spending more in tax, you wouldn't be spending that money necessarily on healthcare. So you have to understand that while you're paying more tax in these countries, you're getting a hell of a lot more for it. You're getting better public education, you're getting better infrastructure, you're getting more investment and assistance to local businesses. You're getting all of these things. And it works out a lot cheaper than you'd be paying for them privately. And for a lot of these things, like healthcare, there is no meaningful choice to be had, even under a private system.
It may well be that American socialists are envisioning moving our policies to align with those of the Nordic countries in the 1970s, when their policies were more in line with economists' traditional definition of socialism. We estimate that if the United States were to adopt these policies, its real GDP would decline by at least 19% in the long run, or about $11,000 per year for the average person.
I don't think they are, and I think these numbers are being pulled out of someone's arse in an attempt to demonise populist left ideas and proposals. Even though the kind of shift to the left that we would see in the US would be slight, even if it succeeded. Even the wildest of Bernie Sanders' ideas are not particularly radical whatsoever in a global context. So I don't know where they're getting these ideas at all. It seems malicious.
The Nordic and European versions of socialized medicine have been viewed as so desirable by modern US socialists that they have proposed nationalizing payments for the healthcare sector, which makes up more than a sixth of the US economy, through the recent Medicare for All proposal. This policy would distribute healthcare for free, i.e. without cost sharing, through a monopoly government health insurer that would centrally set all prices paid to suppliers such as doctors and hospitals. We find that if this policy were financed out of current federal spending without borrowing or tax increases, then more than half the existing federal budget would need to be cut, or, if it were financed through higher taxes, GDP would fall by 9%, or about $7,000 per person in 2022, due to high tax rates that would reduce incentives to supply the factors of production. Evidence on the productivity and effectiveness of single-payer systems suggests that Medicare for All would reduce both short and long-run longevity and health, despite increasing somewhat the population with health insurance.
That's where this ends, but it does seem to have a problem with not understanding the balances of things. I mean, people pay for healthcare currently in the United States privately, and it costs a huge amount of money. So if you shifted that to a public system and did raise tax, people would overall be paying less money for healthcare than they currently pay, and by all other examples that we have, getting a better system, more value for money. So that would increase the amount of disposable income, even though taxes have gone up because people wouldn't be paying through the nose for their private care at this point. In terms of life expectancy, I don't know what the fuck they're talking about. When it comes to life expectancy, the United States is currently ranked 31st in the world. This is behind such advanced first world nations as Costa Rica, Chile, Slovenia, Greece, despite all its current financial problems. Who's top? Japan, socialised healthcare. Switzerland, number 2, socialised healthcare. Singapore, socialised healthcare. And so it goes, and so it goes, and so it goes. I mean, in the United Kingdom, we're very proud of our NHS, but it's been starved of funding. It's going to be having problems when we leave the EU and so on. But we're still 11 places ahead of the United States. And what form does our healthcare take? Socialised. So I have no idea where they're getting that from, but it's just basically untrue. When it comes to cost sharing, when you have a socialised medical care, the cost is shared through everybody, and so the problems are reduced. The bargaining power of the state is increased. Costs go down. You get more value for money, and we know this from every other case. You need to have some other argument against it, and it's probably going to be a purely idealistic one rather than a pragmatic one when you look at these examples. So what is this? I mean, if you look in the full report, it's even crazier, the kinds of examples and things. It's so dishonest. I mean, Trump isn't going to read it. It's 70-odd pages, I think. Let me have a quick look. 72 pages of fairly close text. There is no way in hell Trump is going to read that document. He probably won't even read the summary. But what does it do? What is the point of this? What is the point of demonizing and misrepresenting the views of others? I mean, we know now that that is not politically expedient because of the way the left has attacked the right. So why would the right attack the left using precisely the same kind of dishonest and inaccurate tactics? The name throwing, communist, is just as incorrect and just as laughable as when certain elements of the left call people on the right Nazis and so on. It won't work. It's not going to convince anyone. I mean, this might convince the president if he deigns to read it. But he's probably going to get a summary of a summary, maybe with some cartoon pictures or something. I just think it's important to tackle people and argue with them based on what they actually say, what they actually want, what they actually propose, not these straw men that you almost wish that they were presenting. Otherwise, really, what's the point? And it's losing its effectiveness as a purely rhetorical device to accuse people of being things that they're not. Anyway, I hope this was illuminating. I will put the link down below. If you can slog through it, I suggest reading the full report, because it's just weird. Zang.
Time to light it up, raise it to the sky and watch it burn, burn, burn,
What happened today? See, I don't like the, I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot, you know? But I hate with style and creativity. Yeah!